7th of August on miniature art of Armenia, especially the effect of the Isfahan merchants on the art of Armenians. It will be given by Professor Levon Chukasizyan from Armenia, who is an expert on Armenian art. So everybody's welcome. And a few things about ARPA. The organization of ARPA was founded in 1992. Next year will be our 20th anniversary. And we are organizing a conference, a one-day conference next year to celebrate our 20th anniversary. The conference will be titled approximately, not a final title, but it's approximately will be called Current Issues Facing Armenia and the Diaspora. But the title might change. The central theme is always what I said. We also have activities in Armenia, mainly. We have an educational program for children on health education. Health education and lifestyle is what it's called actually. It's for 7th and 8th graders, where we teach the bad effects of smoking, heavy drinking, the healthy lifestyle essentially for children. We have the same program in Artsakh, in 21 schools in Stepanakert and Shushi. We also have a program called Distance Learning, where experts from various fields give seminars in Los Angeles, and via satellite we join with Armenia, and students and professors and experts follow interactively in Armenia, the main objective being technology transfer. We also have an invention competition, an animal invention competition for university students in Armenia. This is the 4th year we're doing it, and this year we have received 13 different inventions, and we send the inventions to experts to evaluate, and the best inventions receive monetary awards. The first place award is $2,000, second place is $1,600 for the third place, and $400 for the fourth place. So we try to encourage the youth in Armenia to be innovative and create new projects, new products essentially. And we also help and work with the universities and Academy of Sciences in Armenia on various different projects. We organize conferences and also consult, our expert consult with the government of Armenia. So if anybody would like to help, of course, we'll be more than happy to receive your donations. Our treasurer is Harold Demircan. You can give him the check if you would like to help us out. Of course, we'd like to thank the Merdinian School administration, who allows us to use this hall for free all these years. And also would like to thank all those people who help us financially and also support our activities. We are happy to have tonight Peter Hreshdagian to lecture on Armenian DNA, ancient, unique, and relevant. You've all received the announcements. Peter has a bachelor's degree in economics and philosophy from Cornell University and a master's in business administration from the Harvard Business School. He is the chief executive officer of the Univert Group. Univert Group is a company in fertilizers that is an international company. And the headquarters of the company is Brussels, Belgium, where Peter also lives with his family. He's originally from Beirut, Lebanon, born in Aleppo, but then moved to Beirut, Lebanon, and then finally to Belgium. He has been involved in Armenian DNA for the past number of years. He is not a geneticist, as you can tell from his biography, but he has helped generate a great deal of information about the Armenian DNA with his Armenian DNA Project that he actually supports both financially and as part of the administrator for the program. Peters, and there are historians that actually work with him because the generated data is mainly historical, to try to find out about the history of Armenians, essentially where we come from, which he will talk about in a few minutes. He's the grandson of Dr. Hreshdagian, for those of you who know him from Urfa, and also from the other side, grandson of Adur Levonian of Aintab, who has been actually the main leader of the Aintab resistance. Now, before I invite Peter, I'd like to invite Professor Ovanesyan to say a few words about what Peter is doing, the importance of this project, and also a few things.
Very good. Հաջելի է նորեն կրնվել այս սրա, վերջերը շաջախ կլանք այստեղ, որտև շատ հետաքրական երևույթներ մնանանք այս ARPA-ի նախաձեռնությամբ, և այսօր հատկապես ուրախ ենք, որ նորեն կուկանք այստեղ, նորեն շատ հետաքրական զեկուցում և զրույց լսելու համար։ DNA, you know, we've been hearing this word for a few years. It's a mysterious word. It's a wonderful, mysterious word. We hear because of DNA, some people get out of prison. Because of DNA, people 20 years after the fact are convicted. I mean, it's just amazing. And I still haven't figured out quite what it is. I know they test something. And it keeps, you know, it has an enormous history that goes back for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And how they do it, I have no idea. I don't understand that, but it's marvelous. And I recently was tested. And it was really an experience, not the testing, I didn't enjoy that, pushing something, swabbing. But the results that came back from it told me a number of things. First of all, that I'm a mongrel, that I had belonged to many different strains of types, like I think almost all of us do. But more interesting for me was that my DNA is one of the DNAs that many Armenians have, but particularly the Armenians of Karabakh. The Armenians of Karabakh, 40% of them, and I share the same DNA. Now, what does that mean? You know, more investigation may show that in fact my 10th generation back left Karabakh and came to Western Armenia. In our family history, there is a story of our having gone to Sepasja, and from Sepasja coming to Tsopats Ashkar to, I don't know. I do know that it holds for us great potential and possibilities about not only who are the Armenians, but what about Armenian history? People think that the Armenian genocide is controversial. People think that 20th century Armenian history is controversial. But those of you who are following what's going on in the press, what's going on the television, on the cable televisions of Glendale, and in the academy in Armenia, know that ancient history is equally, and if not more, controversial. Huge questions, and you know, a test of loyalty. If you were to suggest that Herodotus was right, and that the Armenians are a mixture of various people plus Indo-European people who came from the outside, then some people consider you to be a traitor, because we have to demonstrate that we were there first, we're the only ones there, we've never mixed with anybody. Now, we hope that's true, but I'm not sure that it is true. And so what DNA can tell us is, in what ways are we unique? I get a question all the time. Were the Uartuans, for example, of the first millennium BC, were the Urartuans Armenians or were they not Armenians? And if they were Armenians, in what way or what degree were they Armenians? Hopefully DNA can tell us that. When I went to Dilzor with my daughter a few years ago, and as anyone who's been there remembers all the bones that we see, what can DNA tell us about these bones? What can it tell us? I don't know, but there's a lot to be learned, a lot from history. In my own personal DNA, as I said, what I can say for sure is that I'm not pure. And it's maybe troubling for us, but it shouldn't be surprising that our DNA is also shared by Turks, by Assyrians, by Arabs and others, and that shouldn't be too surprising. When you just look at a Turk, you see how their face has changed over all these hundreds of years, how many non-Turkish peoples have been absorbed into them. And so the fact that if we take, someone who is a denier of the Armenian genocide and take his DNA, we're going to find obviously that he has what we would be considered probably Armenian blood. I'm not going to say more than that except to say that there is a great deal that we can look forward to. It probably will be controversial. It'll probably take some number of years for it to be accepted. There will be people who will reject it, because if you want to believe that we came from Noah and we're absolutely pure and we haven't intermixed at all since those days, then it's a matter of faith. And if you have faith, then that's okay, that's fine. But scientifically, there's much to be learned, and Peter Hreshdagian is a pioneer in this work. DNA studies he's not a pioneer in DNA studies per se, but in Armenian DNA, and try to understand the DNA. And he's going to, I think this evening, probably with slides and a PowerPoint, help us to understand more about the Armenian DNA and its relevance to us today and to us historically. So we thank you, Peter Hreshdagian, and we heard that you come from a great pedigree of families on both sides, and we're proud that you're here and proud that you're continuing your contribution in your own way to the Armenian people.
Thank you very much for these wonderful introductions. Thank you, Hago. Thank you, Richard. I'm very glad to be here. I don't master the Armenian language, and that way my presentation is going to be in English. I wanted to thank Hagop for his introduction and for hosting me here. He was the very first person with whom I had a dry run of this presentation, because this is the third lecture in the series that you're listening. The first one was at Hreshdagian, the second one in October of last year. The second one was in Montreal a few months ago. But before the Hreshdagian lecture, I got to practice in Anjar. It was my first presentation. There were things that needed to be tweaked and fixed, and it was the first time that I was speaking in public. I'm not a natural public speaker like some of you. Hagop very kindly did a simultaneous Armenian translation to a very interested audience of Musalertsis in Anjar, so it was quite nice. And of course, he and Richard are both tested in the project. I should mention also, Richard, that you found out through your DNA that you had some relatives that you knew could be related to you. They were from the same village, Basmachen, but they were called Hamparzumian. And the DNA showed that, in fact, what the rumor was true, because there was a common ancestors to the Hovhannissians. And I can mention one more person also who belongs to that same group, which you will see, is that Charles Aznavour, the Armenian singer, of course, belongs to that same group called R1B1B2, which is the biggest group in the Armenian population. Since I'm not a geneticist or a biologist, I had to work hard to try to understand the science behind it, but I don't go too deeply into it because you can easily get lost, but you don't need too much science to understand this subject. I'll do a little bit of science so you know what's behind it, but I'll keep it as simple as possible. My job is to try to explain these things to you as best I can. And for those of you, there are a number of you in the audience who have been tested, once you get your results, I try to make sense out of it. So here we go. The title of the lecture is Armenian DNA, Ancient, Unique and Relevant. In my presentation, unique has a question mark next to it. I think in the email, the question mark had disappeared. It's a question that I ask. Is it unique or is it not? And we will get to that during the course of the presentation. These are the three headings. So what is the Armenian DNA Project exactly? It's a project started by three people. Mark Arslan is the person who actually started a project called the Keri Project. He's an Armenian, he's 1/4 Armenian from the Keri region. His grandfather was from there. So he started a project just to be able to use DNA to trace people from the various villages there. He eventually turned his project into the Armenian DNA Project, but it was quite small because it wasn't really publicized. And there were a number of Armenians getting tested left and right because they read about it in the press, but nobody had actually gone out to these people and said, come together in one project, let's collect your DNA so that we can analyze it and discuss it. So I got in touch with Mark and he accepted me in his project. We changed the name a little bit and we launched it in September of 2009. So it's been a little less than a year and a half now. Hovan Simonian, of course, very important. He's the one who urged me to be involved in this project. I had analyzed my own DNA and those of some of my friends. He's a historian, of course, who has some particular interests in groups of Armenians from different regions, and he studies also the Melik families and the royal families to see if there is, if their genealogy corresponds to what the historians think, and if all the people who claim descent from the Mamnigonians, if there is some truth to these kinds of things. And Hovan is very important to our project, of course, because this is data, and if you don't match it to history, it's difficult to make much sense out of it. And that's his specialty, of course. So the three of us run the project. We're looking for a fourth administrator, a biologist, a geneticist who can help us with the tough genetic issues. And we have a few people who are interested. So one day you'll have 4 of us running this project. What's the difference between our project and a study of Armenian DNA, an academic study? We are a collection of individuals. I mean, it's a project in which I am, Richard is, Hagop is, any one of you who wants to be tested, orders a test, and then joins the project. We help you analyze. So it's built from the bottom up, from individuals who get tested. It's limited in number, obviously, because the testing is not that cheap. The cheapest tests run about $150. If you want to complete one, you have to go up to $500 or $600. You have to be motivated, and you have to have that money to waste if you want, or to spend if you want to be tested. And it takes a genealogical approach to some extent, because getting tested helps you find relatives. And what we can do in our project that researchers cannot do is do deep ancestry. We can really spend money to go deeply into the past of each specific group. Academic researchers who are population geneticists, people who work in universities, they like to take a broad approach. They want to test, if they have a budget, instead of testing deeply 50 Armenians, they prefer to take 500 Armenians from different regions and take a broad swath of Armenians. And they consider what we do too much detail, but they find the usefulness in what we're doing, and there's a good relationship between what we do and what they do, because they have this sort of broad approach and comparisons to other populations, and they actually use our data because for them we're pioneers. we're sort of pushing the envelope on this matter. And when it comes to published studies of Armenian DNA, the subject is not that old, but the last paper that came out on Armenian DNA came out in 2001. So it's been 10 years since we've had a good, detailed paper on Armenian DNA. The second author on the paper, which came out 10 years ago, was Professor Levon Yepiskoposyan, who works in Yerevan at the Academy of Science. And since then, Armenian DNA has been used in various studies, but no paper on Armenian DNA has actually come out. There are a lot of papers in the works as we speak. I've been privileged to see some of the data and to get a feel for what's coming out. Look for these things towards the end of the year and certainly next year, where you'll see a lot of papers on Armenian DNA, and it's going to be quite interesting. Getting back to our project, this shows you graphically what we've done. I should actually pause here to put a little pointer, which will be helpful to highlight things. Here we go. Or to move the slides. Yeah. Perfect. So what you see here is the beginning of the project, the Keri project in 2005. They were running at around 10 people, and I joined in September 2009. And you see, with Hovan's help and my involvement and bringing all together all the Armenians who've been tested, how our numbers basically exploded. We went from 10, 15 people to 533 people in the project right now. So this graph shows you the growth of the project. We'd like that curve not to flatten. We prefer to keep it straight. Ideally exponential, but it's costly. But we really want this thing to develop as much as possible. And our objective for the end of 2012 is to reach the 2,000 level if we can. Now, who is in the project? All the surnames you see here, and some of you are in the audience, are the surnames in the project. I'll give you a little bit of time to take a look. You can see already the advantage for those of you who are interested in genealogy, who wonder where your ancestors are from. The problem with Armenian DNA in general is that, with Armenian names, is that our names change very frequently, depending on which town we came from, which profession somebody was involved in. We also don't have any genealogy. Most of the records were destroyed during the genocide. If you add to that the fact that you have a number of people who are genocide orphans, combine all of these things, and generally Armenians cannot do what Americans of Anglo-Saxon, German, or French descent can do, is actually go to courthouses, churches, etc., and get records of their ancestors. On my wife's side, who's Belgian, I've been able to trace her ancestors back to the 1600s. You can't do that with Armenians. That's why for us, DNA is quite useful. You probably see also in the list towards 2/3 down all of the Meliks in the study. This is Hovan's special project of studying the Melik families. So if you've noticed somebody out there and you think you might be related and you haven't been tested, now's your chance to do that. Another question people often ask is, where do your Armenians come from? Are they Cilician Armenians, or are they representatives of Armenians everywhere? When you join the project, you can fill all sorts of information about yourself, including the towns of your oldest known paternal and maternal ancestors. You put a pin on a map. You use Google Map also for that, and this gives you an idea of the town of ancestry on the paternal side of our project members. And as you can see, it's quite representative of Armenians in general. We have Armenians from all over. From Cilicia, of course, from Western Armenia, from the current Republic of Armenia. We have some from Georgia. We have a lot of people from the Constantinople area. And we have probably around 30 Armenians from Iran. Not all from Julfa, some of them from further north. So quite representative of Armenians in general. And I have seen studies of Armenians from the Republic of Armenia, Karabakh. It's unique, except for some small variations, we find the same groups. So our sample is quite representative of Armenians in general. Now a little bit of science. What is DNA? You have the definition here. What you should know is that 99.9% of human DNA is identical, and 99% of it is identical to that of the apes, the chimpanzees, the great apes. What we're looking for is at the 0.1% or 0.01% sometimes, that is different. Our DNA, so this is the science part. When people, they inherit the human chromosomes from their parents. So you get 2 sets of chromosomes from your parents. 2 of the chromosomes, there's 24 of them in total, 2 of them are the sex chromosomes. If you have an X and a Y, you're a male. If you have 2 X's, you're a female. And it's the father's sperm that determines whether it's a Y sperm or an X one, and whether you're going to be male or female. When you look at a child and you look at his father and mother, and one generation before his grandparents or her grandparents, we are a mix of the DNA of all of our ancestors. So you see here that the mother's DNA is represented by red and orange, the father's by green, and slightly different colors above. A child is a mix of all this. You go back one more generation, it's even more mixing. This type of mixed chromosomes is not very useful for DNA studies, because when it mixes all the time, a brother and sister will have a different mix of DNA from their parents. It's useful, and I will talk about it later, but not for what we're looking for. We are interested in things that change, but don't change too much. And one of the things that doesn't change much is the Y chromosome, because only men have it, and they only inherit it from their father. So it's something which is passed on from one generation to the next on the pure male line. And you can see here that a man's Y chromosome comes from his father's father, etc. In this graph, you see 5 generations, 4 generations above the person. So you see how many ancestors someone has, but when we study the Y DNA of somebody, we're studying the pure paternal line. And this is quite interesting. Armenians, as most populations in the world, are patrilineal society, patriarchal society. So usually the last name is passed on from father to son, so it's quite interesting in terms of DNA studies. For women who do not have a Y chromosome and want to learn about their paternal line, the only alternative is to find a brother, a father, or a paternal uncle to be tested in their place. And that way they can find about their lineage. One advantage about DNA studies for ancestry purposes compared to DNA for medical purposes, which we don't do, is that your results are valid for all the males in your family. So here you see you will have identical DNA to your brother, to your sons, to your father, to your grandfather, to your paternal uncle, etc., etc. So you don't need to buy tests for the whole family. One test is valid for everybody on the paternal line. If this DNA didn't change from one generation to the next, it wouldn't really be interesting, because everybody in the world would have the same Y chromosomes and the same Y DNA. If it changed from one generation to the next, it wouldn't be interesting either, because it would be constantly changing. The beauty of the Y chromosome, the DNA that we use, is that it changes sometimes, every few hundred years. So it becomes useful for genealogical and for historical purposes. On the maternal side, we don't study the X chromosome, and I won't get into that. We study something called mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is a small cell which is a small organism which is found in all of the cells of human beings, which is passed on from a mother to her children. And the of the children, only the daughter passes it on to her children, and her daughter passes it on to her children. This is an organism that lives in the cell. It's not part of the DNA, but it has its own DNA. And it's passed on along a purely maternal line, as you can see in this slide. So we can do the same thing on the maternal side that we can do on the paternal side. But here, you know that the family name on the maternal side changes from one generation to the next, because Armenian women usually take the names of their husbands. So that gives an added difficulty also. And here it's also the same thing as on the paternal side. If it changed all the time, it wouldn't be interesting. If it never changed, it wouldn't be interesting either. But it changes occasionally. And here again, the results for a woman are valid for all the women on her line, plus her sons, of course. This gives you a recap of everything I talked about, and it's the last side on the science end of things. You see on the left, on the blue side, the Y chromosomes. On the far right, the little round thing is the mitochondrial DNA. You see how someone's mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to daughter along the maternal line, and the Y DNA passes on relatively unchanged on the father's line. Everything else in the middle gets mixed, and different people get different mixes of this. It's very interesting information also, and I'll talk about it later. But it's not for the purpose of determining what groups Armenians belong to. So what happens when you analyze the Y chromosome DNA of men? You find that certain mutations. It's hard for me to turn because you don't listen to me on the mics, but I will point them out here. I can pick it up. Okay, that'll be easier. Wonderful. Okay. So you see that scientists who have studied this thing have found that all men in the world have mutations that place them in different categories. And every mutation corresponds to a mutation that happened in one man in thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of years ago. So you can basically, by testing all of the people, all of the men in this room, we all belong to one of these alphabet letters. And the person who is here has this mutation, this mutation, this mutation, this mutation, but he doesn't have the same mutation as somebody who belongs to that group. This is intellectually interesting, but it doesn't speak much. The more interesting thing is that you look at a map of the world, and then you try to see what this alphabet list of groups, where in the world the people who have these alphabet letters live. And this is where you start seeing that the oldest groups, the ones closest to the root, originated in Africa, that you had two waves of people who left Africa. One wave hugged the coast of South Asia and ended up all in this region and in Australia. The second wave went basically to our region, probably along the Mediterranean and into the Fertile Crescent, and from there into Europe and into West Asia. I will talk a lot about West Asia. And thanks to DNA studies, we could prove what people knew also, that most people who live in the Native Americans actually came from Asia through the Bering Strait when this region was iced over. This is interesting, but it doesn't give us a time element. Scientists have been able also to determine when the mutations that I showed 2 slides before, when they actually occurred. So this is quite interesting also, because you see that most people who live outside of Africa actually have ancestors who came about 80 to 90,000 years ago, outside of Africa. And these are the groups Armenians belong to. You will see a slide soon to see which ones we belong to. And on the left, the scale is thousands of years. And when you know that the Armenian people, Armenian language, etc., is about 4,000 years old, maybe a little bit more, the timeline, the cutoff here is 12,000 years, so you're way beyond history. And most of these groups had already come into existence 10 to 15,000 years ago. In this graph also, people have shown the actual location of these groups. Asia, which includes Armenia, West Asia, Africa, and Europe in blue. So you can actually see which groups have remained purely African, which ones are still quite Asian, and which ones are a mix of all three. For the maternal side, it's the same thing. When you analyze the mitochondrial DNA, you get an alphabet list of groups. They're named differently. I don't know why they picked these letters, but it's basically the same thing. This group here is the African group. This is the first wave that came out of Africa and went into Asia, Australia, etc. And these are the groups that are typically European and West Asian, and Armenians belong to these groups. Here again, same slide. If you do it on the maternal side, you get practically the same story, except that the African Eve is a little bit older, goes back about 200,000 years, whereas for men, for the time being, it goes back to 120, 130,000 years, basically. But exactly the same patterns that you see before. And you can do exactly the same graph also, basically splitting people into different groups. Some are from Asia, some Southwest Asia. None are from North Africa except this one little group here. They are off map because these are specifically for Asian and European groups. Now we get to the heart of the issue, Armenian DNA. A few words again about our project. It got started on September 12, 2009. 535 members as of 21 July. Some of the slides have older dates, but everything is still valid. It means 535 DNA kits have been sent out. For those of you who wonder if it means drawing blood or spitting in something, no. You just take something that looks like a little toothbrush and you scratch it on the inside of your cheek. It takes 1 minute. You do it 3 times. You put the tip in a little vial and you mail it to Houston, Texas. It's the lab that we use for the analysis. They're very good, very specialized in non-medical DNA. So 465 kits have been returned. We have 360 Armenian Y-DNA results and 145 maternal results. The reason for this is that most people who order this are men usually, and they're interested in their paternal line. I would have liked to see an equal distribution. This is the surprise, if you want, a little bit. When you look at the results of the Armenians in our project, the colors don't come through very well. These two are yellow. I don't know why they look pale green, but these are yellow color on my slide. These are variations of blue, 2 different types of blue. This is a very surprising result because it shows that Armenians are not homogeneous genetically. This is really a rainbow of different genetic groups. When you look at the Irish, for example, 85% of them belong to this group. When you look at the Poles and the Russians and the East Europeans, you find frequencies of 80% of R1A group, which is only 3% for us. When you look at Arabs, Arabs from Saudi Arabia, not the Arabs from Syria, Iraq, but Arabs from Saudi Arabia, the Bedouins, Yemen, etc., 80% of them are J1. So in most places in the world, specific ethnic groups have a concentration of one haplogroup. Armenians do not. And when you actually put these against the diagram that I showed you before, you'll see here that the biggest group Armenians belong to is on this side, and it differentiated from the others about 50,000 years ago. So if one of you is R1, B1, B2, and another one of you is J1, like me, for example, our potential common ancestor lived 50,000 years ago, so we're way beyond genealogy, history, Armenians, or anything. The second largest groups, there are 3 of them in the 10 to 20% range, J2, J1, and J. They are also quite different from each other, and they separated a long, long time ago. And then you have 3 groups which represent 5 or 9% of the Armenian population, and you have here 5, 6, 7 groups which are between 1 and 4%. This is quite diverse, and it shows that we are really, from a genetic point of view, very diverse. We are not all the descendants of Haik, for those of you who believe that. So maybe they're there, but I don't know which group he belonged to. We'd have to find him and test him. Now, it gets even more diverse than that when you dig a little bit deeper. Because here you say to yourself, okay, everybody who's J2 had a common ancestor. Yes, but when? J2 is about 25,000 years old, we think. And there are many types of J2s. J2A is about 18,000 years old. When you look at the mutations within J2, the initial tree I showed you showed only the mutation for J. Here you see the tree of J2. Again, what I said before is still valid here. Someone who belongs to this group has this mutation, this mutation, this mutation, this mutation. Every time it's one man who developed that mutation, who wasn't killed, who didn't die, who had sons who were successful, who multiplied, who had more sons, and this whole lineage survives. There are many groups that are inexistent now because they were killed off. And I think that if you go back 10,000 years, 99% of the groups or existing at the time have now disappeared. We are just what is left of the remaining and surviving groups. And here, when you look at the Armenians who belong to J2, what do you find? You find them all over the place. And everyone is very different from the other. And every single one of them separated from the others before we became Armenians. You do this for G, which is another group, the third largest for Armenians. Exactly the same story. Extremely diverse. We're all over the map. If you look at Georgians who are G, they're practically all part of one group. There is one Jewish G2 group. They're all G2C. We have one Armenian who seems to be a very old version of this, from the time maybe when the ancestors of both were not already differentiated. But Armenians are all over the map. So if you analyze the groups to which we belong, you see that we belong to a rainbow of 14 different groups, but these 14 different groups, you can split them into 60 different branches. And every single one of these branches was in existence before we became Armenians. So this is something rather mind-blowing, I find. We're not like all Celts and all Saxons. Armenians are very, very diverse. Now this is true on the paternal side. You might ask yourself, maybe it's a diverse group of men who came and found one tribe of Amazon women. No. On the maternal side, it's exactly the same. Very, very diverse. It's practically the same kind of rainbow. And when you apply it to the diagram I showed, it's the same thing. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 groups which represent between 10 and 20% of Armenian female lines, very distant from each other, some separated 60,000 years ago. So very, very old. Exactly the same story. You do the same kind of analysis that I did before for the mitochondrial DNA. 13 different groups, you can split into 55 different branches, and most of them are even older than the paternal branches. So the Armenian men took their women from different places, or the Armenian women took their men from very different groups. So, this is the first surprising finding, if you want a little bit. What is an Armenian from a genetic point of view? Is there such a thing as a typical Armenian? These are questions you might ask yourself. And the answer to the first question is, I don't know. Frankly, you cannot define an Armenian from a genetic point of view. And I think it's very clear to all of you that you cannot say by testing somebody, aha, I know he's Armenian because he belongs to that group, because he can belong to so many different groups that it's practically impossible to be sure. Now, people ask, which of these groups is typically Armenian? And here again, if you go back for maternal groups, you cannot say, yes, these are the typical Armenians. All the others are not typical Armenians. We don't know. There is no such thing as an Armenian from a genetic point of view. We are defined by our culture, by our language, by our religion, but we are not distinct. You cannot test somebody and say for sure he is an Armenian. And later I will be speaking about comparisons to other groups of people. The last point on this slide is that we are a very diverse people, but is there evidence of migrations, of invasions? All the people who went through our territory, did they leave a mark or did they not? And this, to me, is quite surprising also, is that ever since we became Armenians, we seem to have been very stable in our genetic makeup. We don't find much trace of invaders, be they Arab invaders, Turkish invaders, or people who came like the Crusaders, for example. We know they married into Armenian society. We know a lot of Armenian princesses married Crusader kings, but so far, for example, we haven't really got anybody who seems to be of clear Crusader background. We don't have anybody of Central Asian Turkic background. So we have remained homogeneous in our diversity, if it makes sense. So ever since we became Armenian, we seem to have remained quite stable. Now, there are exceptions, of course. There are very interesting groups. There are things that need to be studied. And I will get into that a little bit later. So I think I demonstrated here the diversity and the ancientness of Armenian DNA. As you can see, we're going way beyond the period of when we became Armenian. We're in the thousands and tens of thousands of years time frame here. So the first title of the talk, that Armenian DNA is ancient, is indeed true. Now, is it unique? It's a question we might ask. Here, I invite you to read what some of the people who are involved in the field have said about our DNA results. Doron Behar lives in Israel. He's really the specialist of mitochondrial DNA. He's always surprised when he sees Armenian DNA samples. He has published a number of papers on Jewish DNA, but he finds Armenian DNA very unique from his point of view. Bennett Greenspan is the founder of Family Tree DNA. He's the president and founder of the company that we use for the testing, which to us is the best of all the companies available out there. Unfortunately, some Armenians get tested at other companies and they don't get good enough answers and they cannot transfer their tests to our project, so they end up having to repurchase a new test. These people are very good, they're very responsive to our demands. Whenever we need something, they really respond because they know that we are a very dynamic project. Other people also involved in studies, Armenians never cease to surprise, showing a lot of diversity. What appeals to others about Armenian DNA is that we seem to be a window of what they were, or what some of the other populations were in the past. And since we didn't mix much and we stayed put, now it's true that there have been a lot of migrations out of Armenia, but these people have mixed into the other populations. But there was very little migration into Armenia. So our DNA is very interesting to people who study European and West Asian DNA. But it is not unique. And the only reason why people are reacting excitedly about these results is that we're the only ones from our region at this stage who are really investing a lot of time and money into getting tested. Once the other people from the region do the same, then you will realize, as I will discuss soon, that we're not that unique, because our DNA is not much different than that from the people from our region. So the only thing unique about us is that we're at the vanguard in terms of studying and analyzing all this. The third heading in my talk was relevant. This is what I just mentioned also. since most of the European and West Asian groups arrived in our region before disseminating, a lot of people find Armenian DNA relevant for the study of DNA of other populations. And they are incorporating this more and more. This is a map of where the major groups to which Armenians belong. You see J, R1, R1I, G, R, IJ, all these F. We have all of these groups, R1A, R2, and L. We don't have any of these three groups because they're typically Asian. And we have a few isolated examples of Q, which are very interesting special cases for us. On the maternal side, it's the same thing. Most of the groups came into our region before going into Europe and into West Asia. So I have addressed these, the three titles of the talk. And as Richard mentioned, and I'm sure and I hope you can see, this type of information is quite interesting for people who work in other disciplines. Population geneticists, of course, this is what they do. They study the groups, they compare different populations. Genealogists, as I mentioned, who I know that there are some people who are involved in really collecting and trying to establish online or not elaborate genealogies, Armenian genealogies of people from a specific village or from a specific region. If they use DNA to supplement that, then it really helps them build their tree. If they think that there is a relationship between this and that family, but they're not sure, DNA will tell you for sure, because people who are related have very, very similar DNA. Historians, of course, can use this information and to look at their theories in a different angle. Archaeologists also. It has an importance for linguistics, anthropology, ethnology, and of course, when you talk about DNA, for all of you who watch CSI, you know that there's also a medical component to these things. You can get tested to see if you have diseases, etc. So DNA is interesting for medical purposes, and AGOP and ARPA are pushing to have DNA labs in Armenia. One of the reasons for this, besides studying history and population genetics, is to look at the medical aspect also of Armenian DNA. And some of you might be familiar with the Mediterranean familial fever, which is typical of Armenians, but is found in other populations also. These are things you can screen for, but we don't get involved at all. Now, agriculture also. Now, one question which can come up is, we've shown which groups Armenians belong to, but is there any diversity within the Armenian population? And what Professor Levon Yepiskoposyan is working on right now as we speak, with samples that he has collected for the last 2 years, is trying to answer that issue. And there is some diversity. Armenians from the north and the Hemshin, for example, who are partly Islamicized Armenians who live in Turkey, have more G and more L. Armenians from Cilicia have more J2. As Richard mentioned, the group to which he belongs to is about 28–30% of the Armenian population, but in Karabakh and Syunik it reaches 40%. And Professor Yepiskoposyan is currently studying the diversity, because not only you can tell that people are from there, but you can also see if that strain is the old version. When you have a lot of diversity within one group, it usually points to that region as being a source. When everybody has a very similar one, it shows that it's one person basically who came and who had a lot of descendants. In the Caucasian tribes of Dagestan, etc., for example, you have some huge concentrations of groups, but that's because you have small villages that have remained basically isolated linguistic units for 10,000 of years, so you have a huge concentration of a small sample. Armenians, there have always been enough Armenians that our samples are very, very representative. And when you go towards Iran, you find slightly more of a certain type. When you do this for the maternal side, you don't find any regional variation. And that's probably due to the patriarchal nature of most Western societies. Now, the next big question you can ask yourself is, all these groups that you mentioned, all these branches, are they native or are they not? And in this slide, I try to address this issue. And 76% of the groups representing 87% of the people tested, so it's the 87% which matters, to me are native. All of these branches were born, they came into existence in our region. And the region, geographically, I would define it as south of the Caucasus Mountains, down to the Zagros Mountains of Iran, and the Taurus Mountains in Cilicia, basically. So this sort of broad area that encompasses the northern Fertile Crescent all the way up to the Caucasus. There are a few groups which we know are not native, but some of them are so ancient that they've probably been present in our area before we became Armenians. We only have very few isolated examples of groups which probably, this one is of Arab ancestry, of relatively recent, let's say 600 years, this person. And a few people here may have come in Roman times or slightly before, but all of this needs to be studied. Q, as I mentioned, is a very special case, and this group also is a little bit unusual. And there's about 4% for which we don't really have any answer. They could very well be native. So what the conclusion we can draw from this is that most of our DNA is native. It didn't come from anywhere else. It's ancient and local. New analysis will help us infirm or confirm what I'm saying, but I'm fairly sure that this will be proven right, and a lot of people are studying these things. Now, the beauty of DNA is that so far I've only been speaking about you, me, all these people here who are getting tested, people who are currently alive, but we might not be representative of the people who lived in the past in our regions. And we can say everything we want about native DNA, non-native DNA, but we'll never know for sure unless we test people who are dug up from tombs or archaeological sites. If you couldn't extract their DNA, you'd never have an answer to that question. But luckily, you can extract ancient DNA. It's a complicated process. You have to be careful about contamination. The lab equipment is very complex. It requires money, so it's not being done on a large scale. And of course, dead people cannot order DNA for themselves, so it has to be scientists who do projects. And unfortunately, so far, no ancient DNA from our region has been studied yet, but I know that some of these things are in the works. There has been one study of a Greek settlement on the southern coast of Turkey, which was abandoned after the Turks came over and the destruction of the Byzantine Empire, and nobody rebuilt that site. And they were able to take about 50 different skeletons from that area, and they analyzed their maternal DNA. The distribution is very similar to that of Armenians and other people from our region. Another fascinating thing that's been done with ancient DNA now is that they dug up an agricultural settlement in Germany, in Saxony, which dates to about 3000 BC, about 5,000 years ago, when agriculture was being introduced in Europe. And they were able to extract the DNA, mainly maternal DNA because it's more resistant, the mitochondrial DNA, from about 40 different people. And then when they got the results, they asked themselves, where do you see the same distribution? And the answer was in Western Anatolia. So for them, they were proof that the early agriculturalists who came into Europe actually came from our region, and they came with their invention. It's not something that was invented and then copied by the people who lived in Europe. And here again, it's ancient DNA demonstrating that it was coming from our regions. So once we are able to extract ancient DNA, once we do very complete analyses, we'll be able to recreate some of the migrations and movements of human populations over the years. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering, what are the implications of DNA on languages? That's something that ancient DNA will never be able to answer, because you can test as many skeletons as you want. They'll tell you what haplogroup they belong to, but they'll never tell you what language they spoke. And frankly, DNA so far doesn't really throw much light on the origin of the Armenian language. As you know, there are two theories about the origin of the Armenian language. One is that it was an Indo-European language which was born, you see on the upper right, on the plains of Russia now, and it was introduced into Armenia by Indo-European speakers related to the Greeks, Phrygians, etc., and it came through Thrace and settled in our region, and where it supplanted some of the local languages. Another theory is that the homeland of Indo-European languages is in the Armenian plateau. But both of these theories, we have problems with the DNA data, because if this is true, we don't find any trace in the Armenian population of these very same populations that went on to populate Eastern Europe and the north of India, Pakistan, etc. They represent only 3% of the Armenian population, so it's kind of difficult to imagine that people who only represent 3% of Armenians now are the ones who brought us the language, and what did their ancestors speak? But if the reverse is true, if this is where the Indo-European languages were born, then everywhere you have Indo-European languages, you should have the same mix as the Armenians, but you don't. You only find it in our regions. So far we don't really have any answers as to where our language came from. Maybe DNA will help, but it's a very complicated subject. I will now touch on some very interesting case studies. This is the largest group to which Armenians belong. The one to which Richard belongs, 40% of people in Karabakh and Syronik, Charles Navour's son, all belong to this group. You don't see, unfortunately, the percentages, but whoops, here it's 80% on this side. Basically, all the Celtic countries, Brittany, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, the Basque Country, they're at 80% of R1b. And then it drops to about 50-60% in Western Europe, 40 to 50% when you get in Germany. You have high percentages in the Celtic portion of Italy, Spain 60%, Portugal 60%. All these people, and most of the West Europeans belong to the group Armenians belong to also. And when this map came out, most people said, without digging into it much further, well, it originated here and it went here clearly. I mean, that's what makes sense. And how did it get to Armenia? Well, simple. If it's Celts, it was the Galatians, who were a Celtic tribe who ended up in the Ankara region, and the rest were all Crusaders. Pierre Zaloua, who studied our Lebanese DNA, found a lot of R1b in Lebanon, and he jumped to the conclusion that it was mainly Crusader DNA. But it's not true, because when you dig a little bit deeper, R1b is actually this much tree structure. Each person being, each mutation representing a person who developed that mutation. And all of the European R1bs that you saw before belong to these two huge branches. So most Europeans or Americans of European descent who get tested belong to one of these groups. That's why we found so many of them, we found so many mutations, because they spend a lot of money on this, but we don't have a single Armenian tested so far who belongs to either one of these groups. On the contrary, Armenians belong to some ancient versions of these very same groups. And in the past year only, based on these results and some ancient DNA studies, population geneticists, historians, etc., have basically come to the conclusion that the ancestors of all these people came from here about 5,000 years ago. And they came very fast because they did not leave much trace in between. They may have come by ship. And once they arrived, they were so successful that they completely displaced the local male population and became the dominant haplogroup, and then ended up spreading all over Western Europe. So this is revolutionizing a little bit people's understanding of history. And now they're digging up some of the old Irish mythology, etc., and saying, okay, in these old mythological books, they thought maybe it was Christian influence to say that their ancestors came from Ararat, but apparently in some of these people, in their old books, they say that their ancestors came from the east on horses. So you have to mix archaeology, linguistics, to basically unravel all this story. And we have one Armenian who belongs to the intermediate group, which eventually generated all of the European groups. This is R1b. This shows you what you do with R1b when you remove the ancient component. It becomes a purely European group. Now here's the third largest group in the Armenian population, G. You find very, very high concentrations in Georgia and in Ossetia, North and South Ossetia. Although these people speak an Iranian language, they are very close genetically to the Georgians. So when people first saw this, they thought G originated in Georgia. But when you analyze the Georgian DNA, you see that they belong to just a few branches. So it's basically a group of people who arrived a few thousand years ago from further south and became dominant in the region. The place where you have the people in which you have the biggest diversity of Gs is Armenians. And most people who study this group are now firmly believe that this is where G originated, because we have the whole palette of groups. And G, by the way, was introduced into Europe by some agriculturalists, but also in Roman times, when the Roman Empire was basically recycling a lot of people within it. The next group, J1, is the one I belong to. It's the majority in Arabs and Jews. It's also a huge majority in the people from Dagestan. But here again, some very recent studies show that the old versions of J1 are from our region, and that these represent younger versions of J1, and the J1 in Dagestan is also a version of the old one, which became very, very concentrated. This group, which is the second largest in Armenians, is a typical signature of the agriculturalists. My group are the pastoralists. These are the people who were sheep herders, goat herders, who became camel herders. They lived a pastoral life, probably. That's why they didn't really spread that much. The people who invented agriculture, they really had a good business model, in Harvard Business School speak. They domesticated animals, they built towns, they built sewage systems, they developed agricultural tools, metallurgy, and they were very successful, and they basically introduced this both in the West and in the East. And you see here the distribution of J2. Very high in Turkey, in Armenia, Greece. Here's an example of a couple of groups that have non-Armenian distributions. You have a few Armenians who belong to these groups. These folks may have been introduced in our region in Roman times, although some people believe that some of these groups may have originated here, but this is what research is slowly showing. This is one group which is clearly East European of background, and the people who are I2B in the Armenian population probably came in Roman or Byzantine times. Not much older, I think. Now, some of you are probably aware of a bone marrow study that was done in Armenians. I need to stop for a second to drink. When we were talking about our project, a lot of people said some people have been collecting DNA from Armenian bone marrow donors. It has nothing to do with what we do, but you can read some of the conclusions from their study, which was published less than a month ago. And it basically confirms what we found, that we are a relatively homogeneous group genetically. They were able to study Armenian subpopulations, and they found that there isn't much variation, and that there was movement from one region to the other. So Armenians from Karabakh would come to Cilicia or move around depending on wars, migration, economic opportunities, etc. And another conclusion from their study is that we have a lot of similarities with neighboring populations. This is the issue I will be addressing soon. So I'll let you finish reading it if you want. It's interesting, one of the conclusions, although these forces of geography, language, and religion kept Armenians apart from their neighbors, they also served as the very forces that gave Armenians a strong sense of religious and cultural identity, and kept them united through their history, a history rife with invasions and mass migrations. I've talked about invasions, but there have been numerous migrations of Armenians out of Armenia, and a repopulation of Armenians in Byzantine times, for example, and more recently by the Iranians, the Armenians who went to New Julfa, and you find traces of people who had distant Armenian ancestry, of course, in various parts of the world. We come back now to what I showed you before, the distribution of Armenians in the Y-DNA haplogroups, and now I'm going to talk about comparisons to other populations. And some of what you're going to see is probably going to surprise you here. Now, here's a comparison of Armenians to Assyrians and Chaldeans. Assyrians and Chaldeans speak a Semitic language. We speak an Indo-European language. And yet, the distribution of Y-DNA haplogroups is practically identical in both. This, plus other data that we have, shows that to a large extent they come from the same source population. When you look at the maternal DNA haplogroups of Armenians, this is what I showed you before, and you compare Armenians to Assyrians, Armenians in red and Assyrians and Chaldeans, of course, in blue, you see exactly the same things. If you compared us to, I don't know, Belgians or Spaniards or people from India, it would be completely different. But this shows that both on the paternal and maternal side, we have a lot of similarities to a group which speaks a very different language and which some people consider to be a sort of northern version of the Arabs, but it's not the case at all. Kurdish Jews on the right, Armenians on the left. And here again, we are struck with the similarities between the two groups. Most Mizrahi Jews, so not Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews, but Jews who are from our region, from Kurdistan, from Iran, Iraq, there are some in Georgia, also Azerbaijan. They are very close in haplogroup distribution to the Armenians. But are they really close to us when you look at all the DNA? And here I come back to what I was discussing before. You can compare people's autosomal DNA. It won't tell you what groups they belong to, but it will tell you if there are affinities between different groups. And here is one study which came out about a year ago, which basically grouped people depending on their overall genetic makeup. And they found that Armenians, Georgians were quite similar. Turks were slightly on the periphery. This is people from the Caucasus. The Europeans closest to us are very often the Tuscans, Spaniards, and Italians to some extent. The Near Easterners closest to us are the Cypriots and the Druze. And the Jews here in red, Ashkenazi Jews, Uzbekistan Jews, Azeri Jews, Georgian Jews, are very closely mixed. No Assyrians were used in that study, but I suspect that if they had been tested, they would have shown up right there in the middle. No Kurds either. When you get into the Arabs, it gets to be quite distant, of course, and the Asians are very far from this group. Here's another comparison that was done by another group of people, and here they found that Turks and Armenians were indistinguishable from an autosomal point of view, and that Assyrians, again, were very close, and that all of the Mizrahi Jews also were quite close to that group. The Georgians in this analysis separated a little bit, and the Arabs, of course, were more separate, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the closest, again, being the Druze and the people from Syria and Cyprus. I'm not going to go into this chart in detail, but you can take people's overall DNA and break it out into regional components. South Asian, East African, West African. Armenians are one of these columns. I'll show you more detailed examples. And when you take very isolated populations, you can see that they are only one color. That's what you use to compare populations. And here's an analysis that was done of people from our region. Here are the Armenians. Here are the Assyrians. These are all speakers of Semitic languages. These are all speakers of non-Semitic languages. By and large, it shows that language and genetics, there is no correlation at all. Just because somebody speaks a Semitic language doesn't mean his ancestors were Arabs. Just because they speak an Indo-European language doesn't mean that they came from the heartland of Indo-European languages. People's languages change all the time. What you can see here also is that Armenians and Assyrians, from an autosomal point of view, are very similar also. Not just Y DNA and maternal DNA, but also autosomal DNA. You see that Jews and Druze also are quite similar. You see that Iraqi Kurds and Iranians share a lot in common. And you see that Turks also belong by and large to another group, to the same type of mixes. But all of these people have an Asian component that we lack and that the Druze lack, but that the Iraqi Jews and Syrians have in small proportions. The Turks, not surprisingly, have a proportion of East European genes that most of the other populations do not have. And this is from their long occupation of the Balkan countries, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Greece, and all these places. A lot of people from this area were taken. Now, there is one project that analyzes individuals. Here's a more detailed comparison of Assyrians and Armenians. These are individuals, Armenians, individual Assyrians. This is the average of both. You see the components, mostly for us, it's Southwest Asian, West Asian, and South European. That's basically the component. You see one person standing out here on the left, different from everybody else, with about 12% European ancestry, which in my chart shows as yellow, which none of the other people have. This person is me, by the way, because I have a German grandmother. You see how immediately I pop out as somebody different. So it's for this purpose, whenever we study autosomal DNA, we want people who are 100% something. Otherwise you get mixes. So in most studies of Armenian autosomal DNA, my results are always automatically excluded because they're not representative. Because I'm not 100% Armenian. Now to the last part of the talk, something that Richard touched on. What about Turks? As some of you may know, but to most of you it will come as a surprise, and to most Turks also probably, they mainly belong to the same groups that we belong to. The typically Central Asian groups are D, C, and B. And in general, when you study Turkish DNA, you find that only between 10 and 12% of their DNA is really from Central Asia. Most people over there, when you ask them where are your ancestors come from, they will tell you that they are from Central Asia. 90% of them, from what I hear, often say they are from Central Asia. But when you study that in detail, you see, genetically, you see that only 10 to 15% of Turkish DNA, and this is from DNA studies by Turks, of the DNA of Turks. The Turks also have a big East European component, which we saw in the autosomal DNA, and you find it in the Y DNA. But all the other groups are very, very similar to Armenian. A very recent study just came out. All of this stuff, by the way, is available on our Facebook site. We use it to keep people informed of the latest discoveries. And they basically put up a line of all the Turkic-speaking people everywhere with some reference populations. And the people from Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, the Uyghur, Uzbeks are really down here. The Turks are much closer to some of the other reference populations that they use. Armenians, Georgians, Greeks, Russians. So in this autosomal study, we see that most Turks are indeed of local origin. Not necessarily Armenian, probably Hellenized Anatolians, people who lived on the Black Sea coast, a lot of populations, certainly Iranians, Kurds, who became Turkish but were Kurdish before. Kurds, by the way, if you didn't notice before, are fairly close to Iranians, but they're all relatively similar to us also. And here is a comparison of Turks to the other Turkish groups and to some other groups. These are the typically Turkish groups, Uyghur, Uzbek, Altai, Tuva. You see that the East Eurasian component, which is in light blue, is very high for them. For the Turks, it's very, very small. And where do you find this same distribution? You find it in Georgians, Armenians, Greeks, Poles. And this is an example of an African, by the way, which shows that that's completely different. And you see that the only people with some African blood are Syrians, a little bit Turkish, and that's also probably from the time the Ottomans were in North Africa. We're reaching the end of the talk. Thanks for putting up with this. I mentioned the studies that are going on right now by the academics on Armenian DNA. Here's a list of what's going on right now. All of these should be published by the end of the year, beginning of next year, and we are cooperating as much as possible. We cannot publish our data because we're not scientists, and it's a collection of individuals getting tested, so we don't fulfill the requirements of what it takes for an academic paper to be published. But the data that we produce is very useful, as I mentioned, because we're pushing the envelope on a lot of things. Professor Episcoposyan and René Herrera here in Miami are working on the autosomal DNA. I forget the number of Armenians, but they've picked Armenians from very specific regions. And a paper should be coming out very soon on this. As soon as it's available, I'll post it on our Facebook site. Professor Episcoposyan and a group in Estonia has studied 400 Armenians. I've seen the data for this. It's similar to ours, and they should be publishing something fairly soon. Also, there is a cooperation on 420 Armenians from Karabakh Unique and Alashkert and Bayazet, 100 Armenians from Cilicia with Pierre Zaluva, whom I mentioned before, with the Genographic Project. This paper should be coming out also probably early next year. There are studies going on of specific Armenian populations, and here I have to thank Hovan Simonian also, who's very interested in these groups. We are studying in our projects the Hamshen to some extent, and Professor Episcoposyan has a paper going out with a colleague of his of 55 Hamshen Armenians. These are people who refused to be Islamicized and left their home regions of the northern Black Sea coast, and they went into Abkhazia and Russia. The people who stayed became Hemshin, Islamicized Armenians who speak an Armenian dialect, which is slowly getting lost. Most of them do not consider themselves Armenian, despite the fact that they speak their language. But their DNA is a little bit different from ours also. It shows some very unique groups also. So it'll be interesting to see where they're from. There's a study of autosomal DNA with a group in University of Arizona. There are a number of studies of Iranian Armenians also going on. And there is a Frenchman who collected a lot of DNA samples. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to talk to him, but he collected them in Aleppo, Beirut, and Anjar, and I suppose they're going to be publishing this also soon. So a lot of things going on. It will show that we are an ancient, not unique, and relevant group, as I mentioned. This is something I just put up. I think DNA is going to be quite useful, not in establishing who we are, but in better understanding our identity. And to finish, I put up some sheets over there, but I think most of them are gone with the tests that I recommend that you purchase. My email address, when I get an email, I answer within 24 hours usually, except for the last 3 weeks here on vacation. We have a Facebook site. We have a website. If you do the Armenian DNA Project, you will see a lot of information. There's a lot of links with tutorials for people who want to understand this a little bit better. It's a complicated subject, so we do what we can to help. And I would like to take the opportunity to plug a project called Hreshdagian. Some of you have heard it, but it's a wonderful project. Nothing to do with DNA. It's my friend, historian Hreshdagian, who has launched this. He's recreating all of the life, the language, the culture, the dances, everything, the cuisine, the agriculture, the industry of all the Armenian towns and villages of the Ottoman Empire. It's a 5-year project which he hopes to complete by the time of the centennial of the genocide. But they've so far done a lot of work on Palu. I don't know if there are any Palutsis here. Have you seen the website or not? You were blown away probably. Okay. So the next town I think is going to be Yozgat. There will be other towns also that follow. And it blends in with what we do also because it goes back very deeply into the past and it sort of brings back to life who we were. This concludes my presentation. When we were setting it up, we can take a few questions here.